Whenever you get imaging done, whether it's an X-ray, an MRI, a CT scan, a needle NCV, an EMG, you should know the basics of what those exams show. So what I want to show you right now is a basic cervical X-ray. And cervical spine is usually shot with a number of views, but the two that will be included in every single X-ray series are going to be what's called A to P, which is straightforward, and lateral, which is a side view of the neck. The side view of the neck is so important, especially if you're in a chiropractic office, because the curve of that neck is going to determine the biomechanics of the entire head. The head is a bowling ball that basically sits on your neck. So if that head is too far forward, guess what? It puts undue pressure on the neck. Sometimes even having a bad neck curve can actually give you lower back pain, because here's what happens. This is a neck curve. This is a mid-back curve. This is a lower back curve, and they sit on top of each other. The neck curve is called a cervical lordosis. If ever you can't remember, you're looking up to see the Lord. This is a kyphosis, that's the thoracic spine, and then the lumbar spine is also lordosis. So cervical and lumbar neck should be a matching curve. So now let's take a look. This individual, this is her side view. This is a lateral view of her neck. Now, you can see that it's curving this way. Well, what should it actually look like? This is what we want a neck curve to look like. You want it to be a nice C-shaped curve. You want big, empty, open disc spaces. And you want each of the vertebrae, which are these little white guys right there, you want them to look pretty much rectangular. And you want the space in between them from front to back to be see-through. Because what you don't see in those spaces are discs. Discs live in those spaces. They shouldn't show up on X-ray though, because they shouldn't be calcified. Things that are calcified, things that are metal, those will show up on X-ray. If a disc shows up on an X-ray, it's because there's calcium around it. So typically they won't show up unless they're degenerated. So this is normal. How do you develop that neck curve? Two different ways. One, you develop it by crawling as a baby, by picking up your head. That develops neck curve. And then two, good posture over time develops neck curve. People will sometimes say, you know, neck curves don't run in my family. What you really want to ask them, did everyone in your family just start walking instead of crawling? Because the neck curve develops from biomechanics. Another group of people who might be missing that neck curve are people who've been in a car accident, some kind of a whiplash injury where their head went back and forth and it literally knocked the curve out of their neck. Now, why do you care that this is curved? Because if the curve is supposed to be like this, the entire spinal cord sits right behind it. So the more it straightens out, the more pressure it puts on that spinal cord. It's like having a bow. If you stretch it and stretch it and stretch it, it won't bounce back. And there are ligaments on the back of the spine and on the front of the spine. Behind it is called a posterior longitudinal ligament. That thing stretches out, and that's why the neck can do this. Over time, in a young person, you can start to trend this back to normal, and you can actually give them a curve. So what should this neck curve actually look like? In a perfect world, you want it to look like this. Nice and C-shaped. But this person's got their head bent back. You want that at neutral. So when you're looking at an X-ray, do you see the disc spaces clearly through? Are the bones rectangular? If they're not rectangular and they look like they've got a spur sticking off of them, which will look like a little hook on the front of the back of the bone, that's what's called degenerative joint disease or arthritis. So you've heard those terms. The question is it mild, moderate, or severe? So the more degeneration there is, the worse the condition gets. And there's another trick. If you find a bone spur on the front of a bone, it's not as big of a deal as if you find a bone spur on the back of a bone. Why? Remember what lives back here? That's where the spinal cord lives. So if you have bone spurs that are on the back there, that's when you get into trouble because you could end up hitting the nerves of the spine or the spinal cord itself. So now that you have an understanding of this, I want to show you one other thing that people don't realize. The reason we care about the neck too is it controls everything that goes through the entire upper extremity, your hands, your fingers, sometimes even the circulation. If you have cold hands and feet, sometimes it's circulation, sometimes it's thyroid, but sometimes it's irritation of a neck nerve. So all of those things matter. This is a dermatome chart, and it shows you that if I misalign this top bone, or actually C2, cervical vertebra 2, there's 7 bones. This is called the cervical spine. If I misalign C2, I could get discomfort in the back of my head. If I misalign C3, I could get discomfort here. Let's say you have someone who's like, oh my God, my shoulders hurt all the time. That could easily be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, C5. C5 and C6 are really important too, because a ton of flexion extension happens at that level. So if you find yourself where you're like, oh my gosh, I can't turn my head from side to side, the majority of the next rotation comes from the top bone. So that could be out of alignment. If you can't bend your head back and forth, one, you could have had a whiplash injury, some kind of an accident, or two, you could have a misaligned C5, C6. Another thing, if you have any kind of weakness, tingling, numbness in your hands, strength issues where you can't grip stuff, or you notice that all of a sudden when you go to write, your handwriting doesn't look right anymore because you can't grip the pen, any of those things, whether it's an itching, a weakness, a numbness, a burning, a radiating, a tingling, all of those are conducted by nerve. And the same nerve can give you many different kinds of pain. So hopefully now you understand how to read just a little bit of a cervical x-ray, and you should look at your own if you have a chance.